Happy 2024, everyone. It is a new year, and so it is time to talk about my favorite reads from 2023. But before we get started, hi, my name's Emily, and I make writing and bookish content here on YouTube. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about these books. These are like my top 10 books of 2023. They are in no particular order, and I'm not even going to talk about like what I rated them because this isn't about, if they were 5 stars or whatever. These are just like the books that like really made me feel something, or books that I just really, really loved for one reason or another, even if they weren't 5 stars. Yeah, so let's just get into it. So the first book I have is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. And this one was one of the last books I read in 2023, but it really, really stuck out to me. And it might be on this list because I read it so late and it's just so fresh. But it was so nice. I really liked this like introverted, scholarly woman who was so used to being like dry and not really having a lot of friends to really opening herself up to this like really beautiful community that she had been staying in. And it was interesting because it was a really kind of slow-paced book up until the end, and then it was like, whoa, we were like in a whole other world. I really, really loved the book. I loved the magic. I loved the fae elements in this book. It seemed a lot more traditional than like what we see in a lot of modern day fantasy. It was just really sweet, and I ended up loving it way more than I thought I would. I know it's like kind of a love it or hate it book. A lot of people enjoyed it and a lot of people really didn't enjoy it. I think if it's just something, if you just want something that's kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say cozy, but it was just interesting, and I really ended up enjoying it. I'm doing a bad job explaining it, I always do. Again, I really loved the fae elements in this and the way it was kind of written like a scholarly journal. So we had like footnotes and stuff like that, and I really thought it was lovely. And yeah, it was a great book. Next is The Poppy War. I couldn't do this video without talking about The Poppy War. I ended up reading all 3 books in the series, so I can tell you, I loved the whole series. I think the 3rd book was maybe the least strong out of all 3 for me, but it ended basically the way it had to. But what a great fantasy series, what a cool magic system. I loved the use of the gods in the pantheon. I loved that Rin was such an unlikable protagonist, and even through all of it, even when I absolutely despised her, I was still rooting for her, which is really hard to do, I think, with someone like her. And so it was a really great job. I think I've now read through all of R.F. Kuang's published works, and I really enjoyed it. I love the way that R.F. Kuang writes, and I think that for fantasy as well, I think it's one that you can get into fairly easily, even if you're not a huge fantasy reader. So if you're someone who wants to get into fantasy, this could be a really great one to start with. It was one of my favorite books of the year. Obviously, it's on this list, and I really didn't know where it was going to go half the time. It did focus very heavily on war, which is not something that I normally enjoy in a lot of fantasy, but for whatever reason, I loved learning like the tactical reasons and the way that the different regions interacted with each other. It was just fascinating, very complicated, but a really enjoyable ride at the same time. Next is Imagin, obviously, by Becky Albertelli. I just knew I was gonna love this book. Imogen's story was so relatable for me as a person, and I think I cried 6 times reading this book. I feel like a lot of people have read a lot of Becky Albertelli's books, so if you've read any of her books, it, reads very similarly. It's an easy read. It's in that sort of NA-YA transition. It's definitely not like NA to a point where it's like kids can't read it, but it definitely tackles some of like the harder subjects of going away to college and like being in that age. But I really loved Imagin as a character. I related to her completely. Sometimes I like wanted to like message Becky on Instagram and be like, did you put me in this book? Because I feel like you're reading my mind. That is really why this book is on here. I have never really felt so seen in a book before. So it was a really great book, and discovering like who you are at that age is, I think, something a lot of people can relate to. If you're like questioning your identity or who you are, how you fit into the world, I think anyone will relate to this book. But Imagin also has lots of anxiety, and like, I get it. She gets me. The next book I want to talk about is Beartown by Fredrik Backman. I did a whole review video for this book, so if you are really interested to hear about my thoughts on this book in great detail, I will, put it in the cards up above and in the description below. This book was amazing. It hits some really tough topics, but I think that Fredrik does a really great job kind of creating this town and somehow making a cast of characters that is so large feel like you've lived in this town your whole life. I really felt like I knew these characters. And, you know, it kind of is one of those books where overall, not with every character, but you see the struggles of every character internally, and you see what they're fighting for, who they're fighting for, and why they're fighting for it. And it really creates this like kind of masterful quilt of stories into this larger plot and idea of society and the world that we live in, and how we treat people and why we treat them a certain way, and, you know, is that right, is that wrong? And it tackles a lot of like morality and stuff like that as well, and struggles internal and externally. So, you know, even if you don't like hockey, you will still understand what's happening in this book, I promise you. It does revolve around hockey a lot, but you don't need to understand hockey to understand this book. But it was heart-wrenching and amazing, and I can't stop thinking about it, even now. My one nonfiction book on this list. If there's one thing you need to know about me, you need to know I love mushrooms. I don't like eating them, but I love mushrooms and like fungi as like a thing, as a being in this world. And I had been dying to read this book, and so I finally read it, and that is Entangled Life. This is a nonfiction book that just talks about mushrooms. I don't want to say much more than that. For nonfiction, it was super accessible. There was never really a moment where I didn't understand what he was talking about. It was really fun because the mycology is such a small science, and relatively a lot of the other people that the author was referencing, I had also already either read something about or like watched their speeches and like them talking about mushrooms already, so that was kind of fun. But what a fun read this was. If you have any interest in mushrooms and like how they work and like how they exist in our world, how they're different than plants, and how they communicate with each other and how they communicate with the humans, and potentially have something to do with our ability to create such complex languages, definitely give this one a read. It was super fascinating. I already want to do a reread just so that I can like reabsorb the information. The next book I want to talk about is All That's Left in the World. This book, I talked about this in my books that are like the Last of Us video game. This book is a apocalypse kind of survival where these two boys meet and decide to travel together to try and escape the country basically in this post-apocalyptic world. That's like very bare bones what this book is. If you're someone who likes The Last of Us or those kinds of stories, this is one that I think you will really, really enjoy. It was such a pleasure to read. Again, I cried reading this book. It's very like coming of age, adventurous, a little bit dark at times, a little scary at times, but this book, it was really, it's another one that really sat with me and like stayed with me. Next is the 5th season, or the Broken Earth trilogy. This is another trilogy that I finished this year, and it was amazing. I do not even want to say anything about this book because I feel like you need to experience it for yourself. This is another kind of like post-apocalyptic, like way in the future kind of world. And it is partially written in second person, which is very rare. So if you don't know what second person is, it is when the narrator is speaking to you directly. So it says, you did this, you do that, you said this, which is not always easy to pull off, but N.K. Jemisin does an amazing job with this book, and the whole trilogy is just absolutely brilliant, and you've got to read it. You've got to read it. If you love fantasy, it's up there amongst the best. Truly. Next is Get a Life, Chloe Brown. This is a romance that I read earlier this year. I actually ended up listening to it on audiobook. It was one of the first audiobooks I listened to the whole year, and what a pleasure this was. It was funny, it was insightful, it was everything. I cannot wait to read the rest of the Brown Sisters trilogy. I'm not someone who reads a ton of romance, so I know I'm like way behind reading this book, but wow, I really, really enjoyed it. And I think part of it is the writing, but also I think the voice actor who read the audiobook did a phenomenal job. And I just thought Chloe was so sweet, and I think, you know, it was so funny. She's like a very prim and proper kind of person, and the guy that she kind of falls in love with, of course, is very different than her, and they kind of bring out the best in each other. And I love books like that, where it's like someone that you never thought you could fall in love with, you fall in love with. And yeah, it was so sweet, and I definitely recommend this book. if you're someone who is like dipping their toes into contemporary romance, I think this is one that would be very easy to get into and is just really enjoyable. And what I really liked about it as well is that, yeah, the romance was fairly central to the plot, but a lot of it was also about Chloe's growth as a human being and a person. And, you know, yes, it's a romance book first, but it really did feel like the romance was second to her own personal growth, and I love that. This is going to be different than a lot of the other books on this list, but it is cold as hell, and this one actually I got recommended to me on Reddit of all places because I wanted a book that reminded me of Red Dead Redemption 2, which is one of my favorite video games of all time. And again, this was the audiobook. It was read by the actor who played Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2, and so I had to listen to the audiobook, and it was wonderfully done, of course. I had no doubts about it. It was such a pleasure to listen to. In this book, our main character, I cannot remember his name, it's been a while, is dead. But he is kind of brought back to life to serve a higher power and to kill demons and beasts on our earth. So he kind of comes back to town, something bad is going down, and he is now kind of investigating it and trying to figure out what's going on with this sort of otherworldly creature. And along the way, chaos ensues, you know, that whole sort of thing. If you're into fantasy or crime novels, or you want to just try something different, I definitely recommend this book. It's kind of like a Western, but I would say a bit more than that. And so, yeah, I don't really have anything to compare it to because it's the only book I've really read that's a lot like this. But I loved the audiobook, so if you're looking for an audiobook to listen to, I definitely recommend this one. If you're someone who likes Red Dead Redemption 2, I definitely would recommend this one to you as well. Next one I want to talk about is Tender is the Flesh. Now, I feel like this book has been talked about a lot. I don't really have anything to add to the conversation, but the reason this book is on this list is because this is one of those books that has kind of just stuck with me. It's not necessarily that it was like the best book I've ever read, or it's like a book that I will never stop talking about or whatever, but it's one that since I've read it, I haven't stopped thinking about. If you don't know what it's about, it is about a kind of post-apocalyptic, a lot of apocalypse books on this actually, where humans can't eat meat because of a disease, and so they start raising humans as cattle, some humans as cattle, and they call them heads, and that is how humans eat meat, is like, it's human meat, right? It's like a cannibalistic society. Super messed up, super gross, but the main character is gifted one of these heads to live in his house, and instead of like, I don't know, putting her in a barn or something like that, like she lives in his house with him, and they kind of form a relationship, though of course she can't speak because they have no tongues. It's like super messed up. But the questions and the ideas that this book puts forward, I just like haven't really stopped thinking about since I read this book. And the ending as well. It's just one that's really stuck with me. And yeah, I don't really want to say much more than that. It's definitely one that if you haven't read it, you should go into it not really knowing anything and just kind of form your own opinions about it as you read. But yeah, this one, that's why this one's on here. And the last book on this list is the Travelling Cat Chronicles. In this book, I was sobbing on the couch uncontrollably reading this book. It's about love, and it's about like the love that people share with their pets and how our pets love us back in like a weird way. It's about a man who has a cat and he is looking to find a new home for his cat. And so they go to all these different houses and they're trying to like kind of interview the people. They're like humans, like friends, but it's told from the cat's point of view, which makes for a very fun narrator, and the way that he kind of interacts with the world and the people around him, it's very fun. And where they all go and like what they do, and it's a slow-paced book. It's not one that you read because it's plot heavy, it's one that you read because of the relationship and the story that's slowly being told to you through this cat's point of view. This book made me cry uncontrollably. I don't want to say much more than that. It's definitely worth the read if you are looking for something more emotional and reflective and slow-paced. So yeah, definitely a great one. And that is it. Those are my top books from 2023. Let me know what your favorite books are that you read in 2023 in the comments below, and tell me if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were about them. I hope you are having a great 2023 so far. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.